John sat in shock as he listened to his future wife finish her statement, his anger surging through his body. John was driving to the show for their regular day when he asked Jenny if she wanted to take a week and go camping with him after her college classes ended in a couple of weeks. Jenny said, "John, you know I'm leaving the day after classes are over. Rachel, Emily, and I already have almost all our things packed, ready to leave. We're taking the whole summer for a trip out west." "Jenny, if you think I'll allow that, you're crazy. I thought when we decided to get married, you agreed not to go on this trip. What changed your mind?" "Oh, John, I never said that. You know we've been planning on taking this trip ever since we started college. We've been saving every cent we could to pay for it, but we will still have to work some on the trip unless we can find someone to help pay our way. Do you know how hard it was to cut costs and overstate our expenses so our parents would give us more money to save for the trip? How could you even think for a minute I would miss out on the trip of a lifetime? John, I know how those two friends of yours get when they get away from home. I also know how they find someone to help them pay expenses they can't cover themselves. When they get a drink or two in them, their heels get round, and they fall onto their backs in the dying cockroach position. Hell, I have nightmares of seeing them in different positions after one of your girls' nights out. I don't want you to even go out alone with them here, and I sure don't want you to spend the summer with them 24/7. You scum sucker. Those are my best friends. I will not allow you to talk about them like that. I am sorry, honey, but it's a done deal. You knew when we started dating I planned to take this trip. Nothing has changed. You go off on your short reserve trips, and I trust you. What's the difference here? Jenny, you know what the difference is. I am a citizen soldier. I go to training and on to active duty if, and when I am called up. It is part of my job. When I'm there, I work mostly. I don't have time to chase girls, even if I had the desire. If you take this trip, we won't last. Even if you aren't planning to cheat on me, you will get drunk and slip, or those two will talk you into cheating. I promise you that will end us. I won't let you take off like that and expect to come back and find it like it is now. Is that what you want? Are you trying to break up with me? Oh no, honey, never. You're my main man, and will be even after this little trip is over. We'll go off and see the good old US of A. Then I'll come back to you and be your own personal woman for the rest of my life. Jenny, I had better be your only man. If you do this trip, you'll never be my woman again. I won't put up with you sleeping around and running around with those two. Oh, silly. Of course, I'll be your woman. I told you I would come home, and you'd be my main man. Now let it go. I don't want to talk about it anymore. The rest of the evening was a blur in John's mind. He knew he and Jenny went to the movies as they had planned, but he could not remember what the show was about or any of the rest of their conversation. He spent most of the time the show ran thinking about Jenny, her friends, and her insistence on going on their planned trip. He also thought about some of the statements she had made over the last year they had been dating. They held a certain amount of contempt for him and displayed her selfish attitude. John noticed with shock that the credits were streaming on the screen and people were leaving the theater. Jenny stood and took his hand to leave. They didn't tarry after the show and get a snack or drink at their normal hangout. John just took Jenny straight home, walked her to her door, and turned to leave. He stopped when she grabbed his arm and pulled him back. John, what's the matter with you? We didn't stop for supper and a drink like we usually do, and now you're just going to leave me at the door. Aren't you coming in like you usually do? I was really looking forward to you staying again tonight. No, Jenny, I am not coming in. I don't know when I'll come in again if I ever do. You have to decide what you want before I do that again. I promise you one thing right now, though. If you go whoring around with your friends like you plan to do this summer, I promise you'll never see me in your house or bed again. John walked off. Jenny reached for him again, but missed his arm. She trotted 3 steps after him, then wailed, John, you didn't even kiss me goodnight. Why are you being like this anyway?" She glared at him as he opened his truck door and looked over the roof at her as he started to get into his old Ranger. She screamed, "Damn you, John, just go off and sulk. I am taking that trip, and that's final. When we get back, we can set the date for our wedding. Now get over it and stop sulking." Jenny turned and was closing the door to her house before John drove off. She looked up at her two best friends in the world as they stood watching her. Both of them were grinning. Emily said, "I guess he didn't take it too well, huh?" Jenny shook her head no, then grinned a little. She said, "Hell, he'll get over it. He always does when I put my foot down. Besides, he knows he can't find a girl like me." She laughed and continued, "Of course, if I ever find out he has been sleeping with someone else, I'll make sure he doesn't do any sex again for a long time." Shelley laughed and said, "And just how do you think that attitude is fair?" "Shut up. You know I don't share my man with anyone." Emily laughed and said, "You shared Jake with me Wednesday night." "Well, that was just an animated tool. John is my man, and I won't share him. I could care less about the other males in my life. I am not going to marry one of them. I just screw them. Now, where are we going to make our first stop, girls? I'm thinking maybe Butte or Bozeman, Montana. I feel like riding a cowboy for a while before we get any more educated idiots between our legs." John didn't call or visit Jenny again before she left with her friends on the trip of a lifetime. The day after their proposed departure, he did go to her apartment to verify she actually left. The apartment was vacant. He went to Jenny's parents' house to see if she was there. He really didn't want to spend the money for the gas, but he wanted to physically verify her presence or lack of it. It was only a little over 100 miles after all. His little 4-cylinder Ranger got almost 26 miles to the gallon, so the cost wouldn't break him up. Besides wanting to verify Jenny had indeed taken the trip, he needed to return all of Jenny's belongings she left in his apartment. He had no intention of ever seeing her again, and certainly didn't want her personal possessions in his house any longer. When John got to Jenny's home, her father informed him she left on her trip as planned. From the conversation, John came to realize Mr. Stevens was no happier with his youngest daughter than John was. It took them maybe 15 minutes to move her belongings into the house and stack the boxes in her bedroom. John shook hands with her father and drove off, heading back to his lonely apartment. John was 2 years older than Jenny, but was a year behind her in college. He had just finished his associate's degree in construction management. He planned to obtain a bachelor's degree in project management, and after a few years' experience, form his own building construction firm. He was also a staff sergeant in a National Guard engineer company. Between his part-time jobs, the GI Bill, and his reserve pay, John had managed to get this far in college with no debt. He lived in a dump for sure, but he paid his own way. He had no close relatives and no savings, so it was pay as you go or pile up a large debt to pay for college. When his parents died, his father's construction company went bankrupt. All their savings and property were used to pay expenses from their auto accident. All John received from his father's side of the family was a small 80-acre piece of ground in the country. His grandparents left him the land when they died. There was no house on the land. There was a small older building where a few pieces of ancient machinery were stored. When he went to his farm, he camped in the machine shed or alongside a nice little stream in a cave. After he returned from Jenny's childhood home, John terminated his rental agreement on his small apartment. He took all his possessions to his farm and began camping there. He still attended his reserve meetings and did his 2-week summer camp, but other than that, he stayed on his little piece of ground. At first, he lay around, fished, swam, drank, and felt sorry for himself. The pity party lasted almost a week before his funk lifted, and he began his exercise regimen once again. He was, after all, a staff sergeant in the reserves. He had to keep himself in shape before he could perform his duties properly. After 3 weeks lying around, John was bored. He walked out into the machine shed and looked at all the equipment. He knew the old tractor would start. He used it fairly often to bush hog brush and grass around the place. It was still early enough that he could plow up some of the ground and put out a late crop of soybeans. He knew he would have to hire them combined, but what the heck, it would be something to do. And he might make a few extra dollars. John hooked up his plow and started toward the field. He had only made a few passes back and forth when one of the neighbors pulled up and stopped. The neighbor got out of his truck and stood watching John work. When John got close to him, he stopped his tractor and walked over to the neighbor. The man asked, "What you plowing for, John?" "Ah, hell, I was bored and got to remembering when Grandpa used to farm some. I thought I would maybe put in some soybeans. I can get a crop of them in and harvest it this year, I think." "Yeah, boy, you can if you put out short-season beans. You can probably get a pretty good crop, but why you plowing?" "Hell, except for a garden, nobody plows much anymore. We mostly just spray and kill the grass and weeds, and no-till in the crops. Saves time and money. It also adds humus to the soil, protects from erosion, and helps hold moisture for the crops. No more than you are putting out here. I can loan you my machinery if you want. Of course, you break it, you gotta pay to fix it." "Well, I don't know, Mr. Jeffers. I ain't no-till before. I wouldn't know how to do that." "Well, tall as some of these weeds are, you should probably bush hog first, then use Roundup to spray and kill the grass and weeds. After that, you just use my no-till drill, mostly like you would your old drill, and plant the beans. Get Roundup ready seeds so you can spray again after they're up a little, and you're all set. You decide to do corn or wheat next year, you do it just the same." John thought about what Mr. Jeffers said the rest of the evening. It would sure save him a lot of time and fuel if he could do the no-till planting. He decided to give it a try. He had an old spray rig he thought he could get working. He knew his bush hog would work because he used it off and on during the warmer weather. Early the next morning, John began cutting the field with his small equipment. It took him 4 days to do the job, but he stuck with it. After he finished, he hooked up his disc and smoothed out the area he plowed, then went to the neighbors to see about borrowing his no-till planter. He had already purchased the seed for his crop. When John drove up to Mr. Jeffers' house, he found him working in his machine shed on a tall, heavy-built drill. John grinned and got out of his truck. He walked up to Mr. Jeffers and held his hand out to shake. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Jeffers. If you're still willing to loan me your no-till drill, I thought I would take you up on borrowing it. I want to no-till my beans this crop, and then I will check to see if it is better and cheaper for me to do that or put in a crop the old-fashioned way. Hell, I guarantee you it is lots easier and cheap to no-till, and I would appreciate it if you would call me by my name. It's Dan. Hell, you're all grown up now and a man in your own right. We're neighbors and I hope friends, so you don't need to call me Mr. Jeffers. Hell, I hear you're a sergeant in the reserves too. You want me to call you sergeant?" John said, "Hell no, I'm not a sergeant out here." "Well, I guess I am. But since you're not in the military, I'd rather you call me John." "That's what I mean, boy. I'd rather be called Dan by my adult neighbors and friends. Now let's get this drill over to your place and get you started. I'll help you hook your tractor up to this drill here, and I'll tell you how to use it. I'll stick around a while and make sure you get started okay too." Even with the late start, John only took part of 2 days to get the beans drilled. He made sure to clean up the drill for Dan and took it home. His next project was to find the money for fertilizer and get it spread on the field. Before he did that, he took several samples across the field. He took the dirt samples to the county agent for testing to see what mix of fertilizer and lime he needed to apply. To his relief, he didn't need to apply any lime and only a small amount of fertilizer. He bought the fertilizer at the local coop and used one of their spreaders to apply it to the field. After almost 2 weeks of long, hot days' work, John finally found time to sit in front of his cave and relax. He was pleased with his work and looked forward to harvesting a cash crop in the fall. He sat back and listened to the small stream running down the hillside beside his cave. He could hear cattle lowing in the background and machinery working in one of the neighbors' fields. John sat and relaxed, letting his mind wander while he listened to the peaceful sounds of his country home. John thought of Jenny. He wondered what Jenny was doing. He wondered if she was getting as much action as he suspected she was. That thought tore at his soul. He knew he would never know what she did on her trip, unless she or one of her friends let it slip and word got out. He still wasn't sure what he would do when she returned. He was pretty sure they were over, but there was a slight chance they were not. He needed to think things through. His main problem was trust. He had seen the three of them when they were drinking and dancing. They were wild. A time or two, he suspected Jenny would have let a man take her home if he hadn't been with them. She spent way too much time dancing and flirting with men, in his opinion. Some of the short tours and deployments John had been on had caused friction between him and Jenny also. Twice while he was deployed, John was told Jenny was seen out with men. She supposedly looked and acted as if she was on a date. His informants did tell him she was being way too friendly. During one deployment, a friend of his sent him a letter telling him of Jenny's adventures. He enclosed a pretty poor picture for him to see. A different friend told John after he got home that he personally saw Jenny loving up 3 different men at one time or another while he was in Iraq. John asked Jenny about the reports. Of course, she denied dating while he was gone. John chose to accept her and her friend's explanation of her actions, but a small kernel of doubt remained. He knew the friends who told him those things hated Jenny enough to only tell him the things that would make her look the worst to John. Still, where there is smoke, there is fire. John was almost positive Jenny had at least done some heavy petting and flirting while he was gone. But hell, almost everyone flirted from time to time while they were out partying. After a 6-pack of his favorite beer, John came to a conclusion about his life with Jenny. He just plain didn't trust her any longer. He wasn't even sure he still loved her. He was fairly sure if he loved her, the hurt from what he perceived as her cheating and taking the trip would have been greater. John wasn't even sure he loved Jenny enough to marry her, even if she hadn't taken the trip. He was almost positive she didn't love him. At least he was positive she didn't respect him. Her actions and cutting remarks proved that. John decided to move on. He would not search Jenny out when she returned. He had no intention of returning to any of their old haunts, so the likelihood of seeing her by accident was small. He had only brought her to his farm once, and he believed she would not be able to find him here even if she looked for him when she returned. If she looked him up, he would play the reunion by ear. She would have a tough battle on her hands to ever get back together with him, though. As the summer progressed, John continued to work around his little place. If he wasn't doing something for the reserves, he worked on his farm, or at least was on the farm. He turned a garage bay in his machine shed into a small workshop to work on his machinery. He plowed and planted a small garden to raise some of his food for the summer. Right now, he slept in the cave where it was cool. He knew he had to do something about the winter. If he went back to college, he needed to rent an apartment. If he didn't, he needed to figure out where he was going to live during the cold winter months. One day, John was once again thinking about school. He was tired of classes. He was happy here on his little farm and doing short tours for the reserves. He decided, screw it. He was not returning to college in the fall. Then he began to think about living during the winter. He didn't want to go to town and try to find a place to rent. That would mean finding a job in town, and he really didn't want to do that. That, of course, meant he needed to figure out how to make a place tight enough that he could spend the winter on his farm. John knew he could cobble something up in the machine shed, but he didn't like the location. He loved sleeping in his little cave. He was high enough above the stream that he didn't have to worry about floods, and he could see a beautiful view from in front of the cave. He decided to use some of the old concrete blocks and stones to make a wall across the front of the cave. He already had electricity in the cave. One of the first things he had done when his grandparents left him the farm was run lines the 150 feet from the machine shed to the cave, so he would have lights in the evenings. The opening of the cave under the bluff was only about 30 by 15 or 20 feet. The front was about 10 feet high. He could pick up enough stone and blocks to wall that off easily. The floor wasn't perfectly level, but he could even level it out some with a little concrete in strategic locations. John decided he had a plan. Early the next morning, he went to town and made the few purchases he needed to get started. He ordered some sand and gravel to make the concrete and mortar. He purchased and took home his cement and some of the building materials he would need immediately. He ordered a good steel door for the front and 2 triple-pane PVC windows. He also ordered some lumber and metal roofing to make a covered porch for his little cave home. John snorted to himself and admitted, "You really couldn't call this a true cave. It was more like a large overhanging bluff. It was only about 30 feet deep, and the back 6 or 8 feet you couldn't stand in." John planned to close off the rear of his home, where the wall would be 6 feet tall. He would put another steel door into the back wall so he could access the part he closed off. He would use the rear for storage if he needed it. The next day, his building material was delivered by Home Depot. As soon as the truck left, John began getting ready to work. The first thing he did after laying out his proposed walls was hammer drill holes in the rock and place rebar. He formed up and poured concrete to level the area where he would build his stone wall on the cave floor. While that was setting up, John measured out and poured a stem wall for his little porch. He was lucky that the drop-off in front of the cave only required a wall 30 inches high at its highest point. After the concrete was dry enough to remove the forms, John hauled in river gravel to fill in under his porch floor. Then he mixed and poured the concrete for the 30 by 12-foot porch in front of his little cave home. All this work took him a week to complete. It would have taken even longer if he hadn't had a front-end loader on his small 45-horsepower tractor. The day John began mixing and pouring the concrete porch floor, his neighbor across the small stream began cutting the field for hay. When John rested, he would sit and watch the tractor go around and around. He had never seen anyone cut hay as fast as they were cutting. He couldn't recall ever seeing the man on the tractor either. He wondered if it was a custom operator or hired help. That afternoon, after the field was cut, the tractor drove to the stream and stopped just across from where John was working. The operator got off the tractor and limped toward the stream. As they walked, they took off their shirt. When beside the stream, the operator stopped, removed their shoes, then dropped their long pants. John stared in surprise. The tractor operator was a very pretty woman. She looked over at John for a moment, then moved into the stream and dumped herself in the small, deep hole. The deep part of the stream where the woman was trying to swim was not really large enough to swim in. It was maybe 12 feet across and 15 feet long. At its deepest point, it was chest-high and shallower from there. After she had gotten completely wet, the woman lay on her back and just floated in the cool water. John found himself watching instead of working. Finally, with a small shake of his head, John turned back to his work. For the next 30 minutes, John mixed concrete in his small electric mixer and poured it onto his new porch floor. He figured he needed 3 or 4 more mixers full, and he would be done for the day. Then he heard movement, followed by a voice saying, "Hello, I'm Fiona Morgan. I know it's none of my business, but what the heck are you doing to the old cave here?" John said, "Nice to meet you. I'm John Mitchell. I've decided to turn the front part of the cave into my house. I'm pouring the front porch right now. I really need to keep working until I get the concrete poured. I'm not being rude. I just can't let the concrete get too dry, or it won't set up right on the new pour." "Cool. I always used to like to play around in the cave when I was a girl, and we came down to swim. You mind if I look around for a minute or two?" "Nah, go ahead. I'm almost finished here. Then I'm going to clean up and jump in the creek myself. I'll even wear clothes this evening since you're here." Fiona turned and looked at him when John said that. She saw he was smiling and said, "Well, I hope so. I'd hate to have to use my official U.S. Army combat training on you." "You're in the Army." "I am a staff sergeant in the reserves. I've been in a little over 6 years now." "What's your MOS, military occupational specialty?" "I'm not in the Army now. I guess you noticed I don't walk like I should. Sergeant Fiona Morgan, U.S. Army retired, would be more accurate for me, I guess. I was a medic and got a little bunged up on a mission. They sewed me back together, but as you can see, I can't get around as well as I need to, so they put me out to pasture. Now I'm helping Dad and Mom on the farm while I try to decide what I want to do with the rest of my life. I never had much interest in college, and there aren't many jobs around here, so I'm just helping the folks until I decide what to do. I may go on and get my EMT certificate and try to get on with the ambulance district. I've enjoyed being a medic. How about you?" "About the same as you, I guess. I already told you I'm a staff sergeant in the reserves. I've been on 2 deployments, and I take all the short tours I can get. I plan to make the reserves my career. I got my AA degree at the junior college, but I don't want to go on. This 80 acres was Grandpa's, and I inherited it from him when he died. I was lucky he lived longer than my dad. Everything Dad and Mom had went to pay their bills after they died in a car wreck. What you see is all I have in the world, and I'm fine with that. I plan to live here in my cave like a hermit, grow whatever I can on the farm, and take all the short tours I can get from the reserves, and then retire. That's it. Just you and your little piece of ground. Don't you ever plan to get married or anything?" John laughed and said, "Well, I was planning on getting married and doing the old 9 to 5, but she decided she wanted to run around with her girlfriends instead of me, so we split. She's somewhere out west now, drinking and fooling around, I suppose. Yeah, it would be nice to have a woman, but it's not really high on my priorities right now. If I find one, then we'll have to see what I do later." John and Fiona visited for several more minutes. She even drank one of his beers with him before she sighed and said she had to get back home to help with the chores. Before she walked off, she said, "I'll see you around, I suppose, Sergeant. I hope you don't mind if I come by every so often and soak in the creek, do you?" "No, heck, it wouldn't matter if I did. It's your creek also. Your folks' land borders the south side of the creek, so you have as much right to swim in it as I do." John grinned and continued, "Besides, I like the view when you're washing off the dust. It might be a good thing if you made a little noise when you come down, though. I've been known to swim without anything on." Fiona turned and grinned at John. She looked him up and down and said, "I've been known to do that also, but that was years ago before I figured out all you men are just waiting to pounce on us poor defenseless naked women. I may just sneak up on you, though. I might enjoy the view." She laughed and said, "Catch you later, John." 2 days later, Fiona was back. This time she was raking the hay into windrows in preparation for baling it. After she completed that hot, dusty job, she once again drove down beside the small stream and stripped to a bathing suit. John had completed the short wall in the back of his cave by then and was working on the front wall. He had been watching her off and on as she worked. After he used the mortar he had prepared, he put his tools in a water bath and walked to the stream where Fiona was floating. John took off his shoes and waded out into the stream, carrying a pool noodle. When he was in the deepest part, he floated on the noodle and said, "Afternoon, Fiona. Mind if I join you for a while?" Fiona smiled and said, "Not at all. How's it going, John?" The 2 young people visited for several minutes. Then John decided he needed to return to work. He invited Fiona up for another beer before she left. Those 2 days seemed to set a precedent for the rest of the week. After Fiona finished her day's work in the field, she would meet John at the swimming hole, and they would talk. After she finished her swim, she went to John's and had a beer or 2 with him, and looked at the work he had accomplished while she had been gone. John's little home took shape rapidly. He had a 2-level floor inside the cave room. He even managed to pipe in water from the old well and set up a bathroom inside. He had a heck of a time breaking out enough rock to get the water lines and drain lines deep enough so they would not freeze, but he was proud of his accomplishments when he was done. The room under the natural rock was 24 by 15 feet. His bed was in the far rear of the small room. He built a small kitchen area on one side of the front and a sitting area on the other. His bathroom was behind the kitchen area. John was happy he had placed a small wood stove in the room for winter heat. He was good to go. The best thing was he only spent about $3,700 on the building materials for his small room. After the hay was up, John did not see Fiona as often as he had when she was working across the stream from him. She still came to the swimming hole at least twice a week throughout the hot part of the year, though. To his surprise, John found himself looking forward to seeing her. He was disappointed when she did not show up. Finally, on a Wednesday when they were floating in the stream drinking a beer, John asked her out. Fiona looked at John in shock when he asked her for the date. She said, "You're kidding, right?" John's feelings were a little hurt when she said that. He said, "No, I wasn't. I was serious. But if you don't want to go, fine. I just thought we could go out and have some fun. I am sorry I suggested it." Fiona saw the hurt in John's face and said, "Hey, John, I didn't mean to upset you. I was just surprised is all. You've never given me any indication you thought I was anything except a beer-drinking buddy. Besides, I am a shot-up soldier. I can't dance and have trouble walking. My scars are hideous. I've not had a date since I was wounded, and you just surprised me, okay? If I didn't upset you totally, yes, I would like to go out with you, okay?" John found himself smiling. He said, "Great, but you've got it all wrong, Fiona. You may be shot up and have scars, but anyone who can't see what a great person you are doesn't deserve a date with you anyway. I just enjoy being with you. I don't care about the scars, and I'd never like to dance anyway." John was not the most observant person, but then what man is when it comes to women? He really didn't notice the way Fiona's eyes and face lit up when she heard him tell her he enjoyed being with her for her personality and inner beauty rather than her now damaged exterior. She felt her heart fluttered when he said what he said. She could tell from the tone of his voice and his facial expression that he meant every word too. She felt her spirit lift higher than it had been since her injury. She wasn't in love with John, but she was well on her way after that statement. John and Fiona continued to date and visit back and forth throughout the long winter. She was amazed at how cozy his little home under the cliff was and enjoyed every moment she spent within it with John. One spring day, they were once again at John's home visiting. They were sitting on the front porch, watching a typical spring thunderstorm when the wind began blowing much harder and the sky darkened horribly. They heard a loud roaring, and his porch roof began rattling. John watched in amazement as the roof began flexing. The rain was coming down almost sideways and blowing all the way across his porch. All at once, he understood what was happening and grabbed Fiona. He began dragging her toward his front door and shouted, "Tornado! Come on, hurry. We need to get inside under protection." John didn't stop when they got into the main room of his little home. He pulled Fiona to the back and into the small room he used for the storage of his root crops and other bulk items. They closed the door and sat on the floor. After the door closed, they could barely hear the roaring of the storm. Soon they heard a crash of breaking glass. Then shortly thereafter an eerie quiet descended on John's little farm. John waited for another 10 minutes. Then he opened the door into his home and allowed Fiona to follow him out. One of the front windows had been broken, and part of the porch roof was thrown through it. Rain and debris had blown into the room. His bed was damp but not horribly wet. The porch roof was gone, torn away by the wind. John walked out into the now softly falling rain and looked toward his machine shed. It, too, was gone. Some of the roof had fallen on his machinery. Many of the beautiful trees around his home were damaged, some uprooted. Fiona came to John and wrapped her arm around his waist. She leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "Oh, John, I'm so sorry. Come on, let's see what the damage is." They first walked toward the shed. When they turned around the corner of the bluff the cave was in, they saw both their trucks. There was some damage from debris hitting them, and Fiona's front windshield was cracked and starred from a hit in the center by something large and heavy. Both vehicles appeared to be operable, however, even if Fiona's truck was not legal to drive with the damaged windshield. They walked on to the damaged machine shed. Much of John's machinery was bent and damaged from the building falling on it before blowing away. Some of the smaller pieces were rolled around the barnyard. He would have to clear the wreckage off before he could determine if it was damaged enough to be inoperable. He also had a lot of trees to cut and storm damage to repair. It was obvious, however, that this had not been a terribly strong tornado. John's machine shed was blown down more than blown away. Sure, some of the metal siding and roofing was completely gone, but much of the building was lying on top of the machinery stored inside. Fiona and John walked up onto the top of the bluff over the cave home and observed the storm's path. Fiona gasped and grabbed John's arm. She hysterically said, "John, it looks like the storm hit our farm. The house and barns are all damaged. I have to get home and check on Mom and Dad." She took off running or hobbling as fast as she could toward her truck. John ran to catch up to her. When John got to Fiona, she was trying to get into her truck. He grabbed her and held her back. He said, "Wait, Fiona, you can hardly see out of your front window. Come on, let me get my chainsaw, some other tools, and a first aid kit. Then we'll take my truck." John and Fiona rummaged around in his broken-down shed until they came up with a chainsaw, fuel, and oil for it, as well as some ropes and chains, a come-along, and a couple of heavy steel bars to pry with. They then drove out of his lane as fast as they safely could and turned toward Fiona's home. Twice they had to stop and cut trees from the road before they could proceed. Because they had to clear the road, it took them nearly 45 minutes to drive the 2 miles to her home. It would have been faster to go through the fields, probably, except they would have had to cut one of the fences. When they arrived at Fiona's home, they saw the house and outbuildings were destroyed, like John's machine shed. However, the buildings were more blown down than blown away. Fiona ran frantically around screaming for her parents. Finally, she and John heard a muted yell coming from within the wreckage of the house. John backed his truck as close as he could, and they began clearing wreckage from the area the noise was coming from. Fiona was crying as she frantically worked at the wreckage. There was a large tree lying over that corner of the house. After they got the tree cut away, John saw a broken-down cellar door partly covering steps into the cellar underneath the house. The yelling was coming from the cellar. They finished clearing the door, and Fiona rushed down the stairs, screaming for her parents. John followed her, carrying a flashlight. When he got to the bottom of the stairs, he saw Fiona hugging her father and mother. John walked up to Fiona and wrapped his arm around her waist to comfort her also. After the initial euphoria of finding each other safe, Fiona's father, Seth, began walking out of the cellar. When he got to the top of the stairs, he stopped and looked around his farm in shock. Fiona and her mother walked to each side of him, and each wrapped an arm around his waist. John walked up beside them and stood in silence for a moment. After the three began slowly walking around surveying the damage, John followed Fiona. The rain was picking up once more, so he said, "Look, folks, it's getting dark, and the rain is picking up again. Why don't we all go to my place for the night? We can decide what we need to do in the morning and get started on rebuilding. My place isn't the most fancy or comfortable for all of us, but at least it will be dry and warm. I will have to put something over the broken window. Then we'll build a fire and get comfy." The next morning, Fiona and her mother prepared breakfast on John's small wood stove. While they ate their meal, the four friends discussed how to recover from the disaster. John insisted Fiona and her parents planned to stay with him until they could get something set up for themselves. After the meal, they split. Seth, Bridget, and Fiona returned to their place in Fiona's truck. John went to town to purchase replacement materials so he could replace the broken window and porch roof. He also turned his loss into his insurance agent. They promised to have an adjuster out in the next day or two. John was instructed not to begin work rebuilding until after the adjuster had been there. He was allowed to replace the window only because that would safeguard his home from further damage. John also mentioned the damage at the Morgan place. They also insured through the same agent, so he promised to have the adjuster visit them the same day. John returned home with his replacement window and spent the rest of the morning installing it. After that, he worked on his machine shed until he could get his tractor out. Some of the sheet metal was bent on the tractor, but it was otherwise undamaged. Now he was thankful he let the insurance agent talk him into getting a policy that covered his equipment as well as the machine shed and his little shack of a home. Just before dark, Fiona and her father came back to John's with a mattress, refrigerator, and some bedding and clothing for them all. They also had some preserved food in the truck. Bridget had taken the family truck to town to purchase some groceries. They had gotten a generator running and plugged the deep freeze in to keep their frozen food cold. John also got his generator out to run his electric appliances until the power company could restore service. News broadcasts indicated it would probably be later the next day before service would be restored in their area. The next 10 days were hectic. The insurance adjuster was there, and John was awarded $100,000 to rebuild his machine shed and 2 smaller outbuildings. He also was to receive $155,000 for the damage to his machinery and $7,500 for the damage to his small home. Much of the settlement was for labor to rebuild. Much of that would be pure profit for John because he intended to do almost all the work himself. He decided with that kind of money coming to him, he would increase the size of his home to include the 12 by 30-foot porch. He would add a new porch surrounding the 3 sides of the building now. Doing the work himself, it would take more than the $7,500 he received for the damage to the house, but not much more. He would then use the cave portion of the home for a bedroom and the new addition for living, kitchen, and office space. He would even build a larger bathroom just inside the cave with access from the new addition and his bedroom. John got busy digging the footings for his new porch 2 days after he got the promise on the amounts he would receive from the insurance adjuster. He used scrap materials from the blown-down buildings for the formwork. He had the concrete poured and was ready to begin the construction by the time he received his check for the damage. He explained to Fiona and her family what he planned to do, and they were all for it. John planned to bite the bullet and use concrete for the wall of his new house. Then he would put stone on the outside. He hated to spend the money, but he figured he had it now, and it would be worth it if he ever got hit by another tornado. It would also make it easier to heat and cool the house. Besides, the concrete would only cost about $2,500 if he did the work himself and bought ready mix so he could do it all in one pour. He had worked with concrete several times in the military and knew how to do it. He would have to rent the equipment, but that cost would be negligible. John had the concrete poured and was waiting for it to cure enough to remove the forms and begin putting the roof on his new addition when his plans went awry. He received that all too familiar phone call from his reserve unit. Once again, his unit was being called to active duty for service in Iraq. He would be gone for a year once more. While he liked the money this would bring him, he really hated the fact he would have to leave his farm in the shape it was in. When John told Fiona and her parents that evening that he was being called to active duty once more, Fiona said, "Oh crap." She then rushed to him for a hug. John rapidly told the 3 Morgans that they were more than welcome to continue living in his home until such time as they had their own house rebuilt. They had completed the cleanup of their house site and were waiting on a company to come in and build a steel building on a pad that would then be turned into a new home for the family. While they waited, they were continuing to work the farm and clean up the damaged outbuildings. The night before John left, much to his surprise, Fiona came to his bed in the middle of the night. He woke when he felt her crawl into bed with him. She gave him a hot kiss and almost immediately grabbed him. He pushed her back slightly and said, "Fiona, we can't do this now. Your parents are sleeping over there and will hear us for sure." This would not be the first time John and Fiona made love, and he was sure her parents knew they were intimate. But it still bothered John when he thought about doing the deed almost in their faces. Fiona, on the other hand, would not be dissuaded. She gave John a soul-searing kiss and hissed, "I don't care. Mother knows we are lovers, and I am sure Daddy does too. I want to spend one more full night with you before you leave, and I intend to do it." With almost no foreplay, Fiona pulled John and straddled him. They tried to be as quiet as they could, but when Fiona climaxed, she made enough noise that both her parents surely heard. Of course, after the deed was done, the two lovers drifted off to sleep once more and didn't wake until Bridget was preparing breakfast. When she saw John rising from his bed, she poured 3 cups of coffee and placed them on the small table. She was grinning when a very sheepish John walked up for his coffee. John could not look her in the eyes this morning. Bridget took pity on John and said, "I wondered why you two weren't sleeping together before this. I know how you feel about each other, John. It's fine with Seth and me. Fiona is a woman grown, and if she wants to spend the night with her man, a man we all think highly of, then we have nothing to say about it." Finally, the day John had to report to his unit arrived. All 3 of the Morgans watched as John drove off to war once again. Fiona would pick up his truck after his unit deployed and return it to his farm. He had added her name to his checking account, so she could pay his bills while he was gone. She and her father would farm his small acreage for the year he was deployed also. The first 3 days at the reserve center were typical of a unit mobilization. There was paperwork, and more paperwork. There was also the last-minute loadout of equipment that had to be shipped over with them. The larger equipment they would use was already in theater, as was much of their smaller equipment that had been shipped out earlier. On departure day, to John's surprise, Fiona showed up with her parents to see him onto the bus for his departure. Many things were covered at the mobilization station. Medical and dental checks were done on all deploying soldiers. Personnel files were updated. There were legal and other briefings, as well as some concentrated training and weapons qualification. John made use of the legal update this deployment. He made a will leaving all his belongings to Fiona. He never told her about his decision. After 3 weeks at the mobilization station, John's unit of combat engineers was loaded onto aircraft and flown to Kuwait for a short acclimatization period before moving in-country to relieve the engineer unit they were replacing. This replacement took place over a 30-day period. Then John's unit was solely responsible for engineer functions in their assigned area in support of local, Allied, and U.S. forces. John's unit arrived at the beginning of the local summer. By the time midsummer arrived, he was suffering through 130 F temperatures. It was miserably dry and dusty. They worked long days and many nights doing everything an engineer unit did. They did route clearance, built schools, roads, and other structures. They were shot at, cursed at, and always overworked. John loved it and hated it. Many days he took the opportunity to phone back home and talk to Fiona. The L word began to work its way into the conversations. John found himself thinking of her more and more often. He wondered if he really did love her, or if she was just a good friend, a sex buddy. He felt a deeper connection with her than he ever had with good old what's-her-name Jenny. They were almost 3/4 through their deployment when disaster struck. The unit was working on a road out in the mountains when the terror attacked. After almost 30 minutes of constant fighting, John's platoon sergeant was hit. John was the next senior sergeant and found himself thrust into the job. To his credit, he took very little time in settling into the job. He had just become fully cognizant of the location of all platoon members when the platoon leader was also hit. Now John was in charge of what remained of an engineer platoon fighting for their lives. John saw a decrease in the level of fire in one sector he was responsible for and led an attack on the positions of the terrorists. He and 13 of his remaining soldiers moved into the breach and began working down the line of the attackers. The support requested when the contact report was sent finally arrived. The attack helicopters concentrated their fire in support of John and his men. Within 10 minutes of John's counterattack, the terrorists were routed and began withdrawing in defeat. By the time the reinforcements and relief force arrived, all that was left was the mopping up and treating of wounded before evacuation. John was left in the position of platoon sergeant after this action. He turned out to be not only gifted and highly competent in combat, but a superb platoon sergeant in the other aspects of his job. By the time he returned home, he had been promoted to platoon sergeant E7. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his leadership during the terrorist attack. Finally, the day all deployed reservists longed for arrived. They were replaced and returned to the United States, where their unit was demobilized for return to home station. As has become normal in many towns when their National Guard or Reserve unit returns from deployment, John's unit was met by throngs of happy friends and family when the plane landed. To John's surprise, Fiona threw herself into his arms when he made his way into the crowd, hoping to find his truck waiting for him, so he could return to his small farm and relaxing surroundings. John almost fell when Fiona launched herself into his arms. She wrapped her legs around his hips and her arms around his chest and locked her lips onto his. "Oh, John, I've missed you so much. I'm so happy you're home," she said. "Come on, I've got your truck. What do you want to do first? It's almost noon." "I would really like to get some good food. What they served us was fine, but I want to hit all my favorite restaurants as soon as I can. I've missed pizza and good steaks more than anything, I think. Right now, though, I would like to have a pizza from the House of Pizza. It was one of my favorite places when I was going to college here in town. I've dreamed of one of their homemade pizzas almost since we got to Iraq. After that, I just want to go home and sleep for 24 hours. Then I want to eat some more." When they arrived at the House of Pizza, they took John's favorite table. John and Fiona were talking to each other and holding hands across the table when a very pregnant waitress walked up. She pulled her order pad from her pocket and turned to take their order. When her eyes hit John, she dropped her pad and turned white. Then she almost yelled, "John, oh my God, I've been looking all over for you, honey. Where have you been? It's so good to see you again. I've really missed you." She leaned down and tried to hug and kiss John. John looked up and saw Jenny. He jumped back to avoid her attempted hug. It had been over 2 years since they broke up, and she was the last person he was thinking about. He said, "Hello, Jenny." He glanced at her pregnant stomach and continued, "I see you found another boyfriend, or is that a result of your running around with the skanks you call friends?" Jenny left in tears and disappeared into the kitchen. Soon another waitress came to their table and requested their order in a surly manner. John was almost afraid to give it to her for fear they might do something in the back to damage the pizza or make it unsafe to eat. Somehow, Jenny had been known in the past to do things like that in fits of anger to get her perceived revenge against some slight. He looked at Fiona and said, "You know, I think maybe we should just leave. I have lost my appetite after talking with your friend in there." Without a word, Fiona stood and waited for John to rise also. She stepped to him and gave him a kiss, then said, "Honey, I have to use the restroom before we go. I'll just be a minute." The waitress glared at Fiona, then stomped back into the kitchen. John stood beside the front door waiting on Fiona. After a few minutes, he heard voices raised in anger coming from the back of the restaurant. They seemed to be coming from the hallway to the restrooms. He moved so he could see down the hallway and saw Fiona and Jenny facing each other. Their faces showed their anger, and they were talking animatedly. John walked toward the women. He was about halfway across the floor when he heard Jenny say, "I still want to know what you're doing with my fiancé, you crippled up little witch." I heard his unit was called up, but now that he's back, I intend to marry him. So you need to just back off. Fiona laughed and replied, "Honey, he wouldn't marry you after what you've done to him if you were his last chance for matrimony. I can't believe you were so darn stupid that you would leave his arms in bed to play around with your skanky girlfriends for a summer. I know he promised you that if you did that, he would never be your man again. What's the matter? Didn't you believe him?" Fiona looked at Jenny's baby bump and continued, "What happened? You need a papa for your little scumsucker. And when you saw John, you thought you could talk him into filling the bill. I wonder if this is the only little scumsucker you have. Did you maybe find another one on your little slut trip? Now I suggest you just trot back into the kitchen and hide or get back to work. My man and I are leaving, but before I go, I want to leave you with a little advice. I am a retired army sergeant. I learned how to handle little witches like you when I get mad. I can guarantee you don't want to make me mad. It would tick me off royally if I thought you were trying to steal my man. You had your chance, and you blew it. Now get over it, and find another one." Fiona turned and walked toward John. When she reached him, she blushed slightly and wrapped her arm in his. She looked up at John and said, "I am sorry you heard that, John. I hope you don't think I am overstepping my boundaries. Now, can we find something to eat? Then get home. All at once. I really want to get out of this town." When John turned down the lane to his house, Fiona became really animated. She was almost bouncing on her seat. To John, her expression looked like a mixture of excitement and fear. Finally, just before they came into sight of his yard, he asked, "Fiona, what's the matter with you? Why are you looking so nervous all at once?" "Well, you know how you gave me authority to write checks on your account to pay your bills while you were gone. I sort of spent a lot of your money, and now I'm afraid you might be a little upset about it. Dad and Mom thought it was a good idea, and I guess we just talked each other into doing it. I am sorry if I did wrong." John was watching Fiona, trying to decide just what she had done that she thought would upset him. He was almost to where he normally parked his truck before what he was seeing registered in his brain. His house was finished. It was roofed, there was a covered porch on 3 sides, and it was rocked just as he had described wanting it before he left. There were flower beds and shrubs, and a beautifully landscaped yard. His machine shed had been rebuilt, and was even a little larger than before. He stopped the truck and sat looking at his little farm in shock. He felt his stomach clench. From the looks of things, Fiona must have spent everything he received from the insurance, and perhaps a little more. He turned to her, feeling his face puckering in anger. He fought to keep his voice civil. He said, "Fiona, it looks like you spent my whole insurance check, and maybe even some of the army pay they deposited in my accounts. You knew I planned to do the work myself and save some of the money. I didn't want to spend all the money on labor. I wanted to upgrade my machinery too, if I could." Fiona broke in on his conversation. She said, "No, John, I didn't. I wouldn't do that. I did just what you said you intended to do. I tried to only do what you said you wanted for the house and the machine shed. I didn't pay a dime for labor. Everything here was done by Dad, Mom, and I, or free by some of our friends and neighbors. A lot of the neighbors pitched in to help our local hero. Come on, I want to show it to you. I know you'll like it. Please don't get mad until you see it." Fiona pushed John toward his truck door. After they were outside, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the house. She rushed to the door and waited for him to enter the room built on the slab that had been his first front porch. She walked to his desk and pulled his bank book from it. She handed it to him, then turned the computer on. When the computer was booted, she loaded Quicken and showed him a report of all the expenses for the rebuilding she had authorized. John was shocked at the balance shown in his accounts. Fiona had only spent about half what he estimated it would have cost to do the work himself. He sat on his desk chair and clicked his way through several accounts and pages of the reports. He turned to Fiona and said, "How did you do that? You only spent a little over half what I thought materials would cost to finish the job." Fiona smiled and said, "Well, I sort of worked a deal with some of the suppliers. We got a lot of the materials at dealer cost, or a deep discount because of your service. We told the dealers you were deployed in Iraq, and we were rebuilding your farm buildings that were damaged in the tornado before you were deployed. They gave us some really great deals when we explained labor was being donated as a thank you for our local hero. Sometimes they even donated things they said would make the rebuild better, or substituted more expensive items than we ordered." Fiona looked at a shocked John and held her hand out to him. She continued, "Come on, honey, I want you to see the machine shed and shop we built for you too. Then I promised Mom and Dad we would come to their house for supper." John followed Fiona around his yard and machine shed in shock. It was exactly as he had described it when telling her about his plans. In some cases, it was even better. Fiona and her crew even installed compressed air lines to several strategic places in the shed. There was a pit in the floor so he could get under machinery to work if he needed to. The pit was capable of being covered for safety, if not in use. After they finished in the new machine shed, Fiona led John outside and pointed out the fact they even cleaned up the damaged trees from the tornado. She showed him a new shed built behind his house where all the firewood had been stored out of the weather. John was reeling in shock when Fiona led him back into his house and showed him his bedroom inside the old cave. She gently pushed the door closed and turned to John. She moved to him and wrapped him in her arms before giving him a kiss. At first, the kiss was gentle. Then it became more demanding. John felt Fiona's tongue moving into his mouth. She pressed her body against his and moaned. He moaned too and began gently caressing her body. Clothing began to fly, dropping onto the floor haphazardly. John and Fiona collapsed onto his large bed. John's mind was reeling, lost in a sea of passion. His entire world consisted of the beautiful woman receiving pleasure from him and giving him pleasure in return. They moved together, engaging in intense intimacy. John leaned down and kissed Fiona, then collapsed to the side with a sigh. He lay on his back and pulled her to his naked and rapidly cooling body. She laid her head on his shoulder and draped her injured leg over his thigh, pulling him closer. Fiona looked at John's face and sighed, then whispered, "I've missed you so much. I love you, John. I was so worried about you while you were over there." John moved his head slightly and gave Fiona a gentle kiss. He whispered back, "I love you too, Fiona. After seeing and feeling what I have with you, I am sure I never loved Jenny. I don't think I even knew what love was until I met you. Before you had that field baled and the hay hauled, I think I loved you more than I ever did Jenny. I love just being with you, whether sitting quietly, loving, or working. It doesn't matter. Anything I do with you is better than anything I do without you or with others." After a short nap, John rose from his bed. He quietly moved out from under Fiona to head to the bathroom. When he finished, he walked back into the bedroom to find Fiona missing. He turned and walked into the main part of the house and found her in the kitchen, preparing coffee. Fiona looked up at John and smiled. She said, "Why don't you go out on the porch and enjoy the morning while I finish the coffee, honey? I'll bring you a cup when it's ready." John did as Fiona suggested. He sat and watched the sun rise over the trees. He could see the rays of light piercing through the fog rising from the stream. He felt relaxed as he listened to the neighbors' livestock and the birds. John was surprised when Fiona walked up and handed him his coffee. She was as naked as he was. She smiled down at him and moved to a chair beside him. To his surprise, she pulled the chair toward the edge of the porch and sat in it facing him, starting to tease him. She looked into his eyes and smiled. Fiona smiled at John again and licked her lips after she had her first sip of coffee. She smiled once more and said, "You see anything you like here, soldier man?" John grinned and said, "Oh yeah, I've really missed looking out over the stream at your folks' hayfield." Fiona looked shocked for a moment, then grinned back at him and muttered, "You old rascal, I ought to go in and get dressed. That would teach you a lesson, I bet." "No, there's no need to do that. I do see some other things worth looking at now that you mention it." John leered at Fiona, making it very obvious what he was looking at. "You know, it's dangerous to tease a man who's been without a woman's touch, and in the wilds of Iraq, as long as I have been, it could go really hard on you, you know." Fiona laughed and said, "I sure hope so. I think we need to drink our coffee and reintroduce ourselves to each other before we have breakfast and head over to the folks' place." After a passionate reintroduction, John and Fiona took a little nap before she prepared what John referred to as a real breakfast. Fiona made biscuits, ham, and eggs, and hash browns. Of course, there was more coffee to go with the meal. She quickly loaded the dishwasher before they threw on their clothes and headed to her parents' home. They arrived just as Seth and Bridget were sitting down to lunch. Bridget looked up when the young couple walked into the kitchen. She jumped up and began setting 2 more places at the table for them to eat. Fiona looked guilty and said, "Don't do that, Mama. We just finished breakfast about 15 minutes ago. Neither one of us is hungry." "Fiona Morgan, whatever were you doing that you made John wait until noon for breakfast? I thought I raised you better than that." Seth snorted and then laughed. Bridget turned a glare at him, then she blushed. She looked hurriedly toward Fiona, who was covered in a deep blush. Bridget's mouth dropped open in shock. Then she, too, turned deep red. "Oh," she whispered, then rapidly turned to her lunch and began eating. Fiona moved to the cabinet and took out 2 glasses. She put ice in them, then filled them with iced tea. She walked up to John and handed him one. Before she stepped back, she gave him a quick, gentle kiss. She sat at the table beside her mother and stuck her left hand out over her mother's plate. Bridget looked down at the hand, then squealed. She grabbed Fiona's hand to steady it while she looked at the engagement ring. After her parents finished their lunch, Fiona helped her mother clear the table and do the dishes. Seth took John out to sit in the yard and visit. John and Fiona took a load of her belongings back to his home when they left that day. They continued to work his little 80-acre farm. John stayed in the reserves, and they also helped with the work on Fiona's parents' farm. As the years progressed, they took over the complete operation of both farms. After their second child was born, the 2 families traded homes, and Seth and Bridget lived in John's old cave home until they both passed away. John retired from the reserves after 40 years as a command sergeant major. His and Fiona's youngest son continued to operate the combined farms in their turn. John and Fiona moved back into the cave home and let their son and his family have the larger main house. During his life, John made and kept 3 major promises. He promised Jenny that if she left to play around, he would never be in her bed again. He promised to love, honor, and cherish Fiona until death did them part, which he did. He promised her father that he would care for his daughter, which he did. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.